Hello and welcome to Dreamtime History. Picture yourself standing alone in a darkened museum hall beside the hull of an ancient ship. Its wooden ribs rise like a skeleton in the soft light, each plank weathered by centuries yet still holding the memory of Atlantic storms. This is the Gokstad ship, pulled from Norwegian clay more than a century ago, built with nothing more than axes and adzes, shaped by hands that knew no steel saws or powered tools. This vessel once slipped through fjords and across open seas with a grace that defied its crude construction. How did such simple technology become the instrument that rewrote the map of medieval Europe? How did ships built from split oak and iron rivets carry warriors up rivers that seemed impossibly distant from the sea? What made these longships so perfectly suited to their violent age that they could appear anywhere, strike without warning, and vanish like mist? Tonight, we will uncover the forgotten engineering secrets that turned humble timber into the most feared vessels of their time. But before we set sail, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight, so I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. You might imagine that the longship appeared suddenly in history, like a dark revelation emerging from northern mists to terrorize the coasts of Europe. The popular image suggests that sometime around the end of the 8th century, Scandinavian shipwrights experienced a moment of brilliant inspiration and created, almost from nothing, the perfect vessel for raid and conquest. But the truth is far more patient, far more mysterious, and infinitely more satisfying than any tale of sudden genius. To understand the longship, we must travel backward through centuries of quiet experimentation, following faint traces carved into stone and preserved in the cold clay of ancient graves. We must stand before weathered rock faces in Norway and Sweden, where Bronze Age artists working perhaps 1500 years before the first recorded Viking raid chiseled images of long, graceful vessels into the living granite. These carvings, scattered across the Scandinavian landscape like whispered prophecies, show us boats with raised stems and crews of oarsmen, vessels that already contain the essential DNA of what would become the most feared ships in medieval Europe. The artists who created these images lived in a world we can barely imagine. Bronze was still precious, iron unknown to most craftsmen, yet they understood something profound about the relationship between water and wood, between the shape of a hull and the rhythm of the sea. Their boats, captured in stone with careful, repetitive strokes, reveal a design philosophy that would endure for millennia. Long hulls with shallow draft, flexible, construction that could bend with the waves rather than fight them, and the understanding that speed and stealth often mattered more than size or armour. Move forward through the centuries, and you encounter the Nydam boat, pulled from a Danish bog and dated to the 4th century of the Common Era. Here is no longer an artist's interpretation, but the actual timber, the real planks and iron rivets of a vessel that sailed these waters when Rome still ruled much of Europe. The Nydam boat stretches nearly 70 feet in length, built with overlapping planks in the clinker tradition that would define northern shipbuilding for centuries to come. 28 oars once propelled this craft through the Baltic waters, and though it carries no mast, you can see in its lines the growing confidence of builders who understood that a ship was not merely a floating platform, but a living thing that must work in harmony with wind and wave. What strikes you most about these early vessels is not their strangeness, but their familiarity. Stand beside the Nydam boat in its museum case, and you are looking at technology that already embodies most of the principles that would make the Viking Longship so formidable centuries later. The overlapping strakes, the flexible hull construction, the emphasis on length over beam, the shallow draft that would allow penetration of rivers and estuaries, all of these elements were already present, waiting only for refinement and the cultural circumstances that would make them instruments of expansion and terror. This is the secret that modern scholarship has slowly revealed. Technological revolutions almost never emerge from empty air. They grow instead from long chains of patient experimentation, small improvements accumulated over generations, traditions passed from father to son, in workshops and boatyards where the smell of pine shavings mingles with the salt air. The Viking Longship represents not a sudden breakthrough, but the flowering of a tradition that stretched back through centuries of coastal life in Scandinavia, a tradition maintained by people whose very survival depended on their ability to move safely and swiftly across water. Consider the continuity of this tradition. The Bronze Age rock carvings show us the essential idea: a long, narrow vessel with raised stems. The Needham boat, built perhaps 1,000 years later, demonstrates the mature clinker technique and the understanding of flexibility that would become central to northern shipbuilding. Between these 2 points lie centuries of quiet development. Boats built and tested and improved, lessons learned from storms survived, and storms that claimed both vessels and crews. The people who preserved and developed this tradition lived in a world where water was not an obstacle but a highway. For them, the sea and the countless rivers, lakes, and fjords of Scandinavia offered the most reliable means of transportation across a landscape often blocked by dense forest, impassable bog, and mountain barrier. A good boat was not a luxury but a necessity, as essential to daily life as the axe or the plough. In such a world, shipbuilding knowledge became cultural treasure, preserved and refined with the same care that other societies devoted to metalworking or agriculture. This long tradition of experimentation explains why the Viking Longship, when it finally emerged in its mature form, seemed to possess an almost supernatural perfection for its intended purpose. It was not the product of a single brilliant mind, but the culmination of countless generations of trial and error, success and failure, improvement and refinement. The shipwrights who built the vessels that would carry raiders to Lindisfarne and traders to Constantinople inherited a tradition already ancient in their time, a tradition that had been testing wood against water for more than a millennium. So when you next encounter the image of a Viking longship, remember that you are looking not at a sudden invention, but at the final chapter of a very long story. Remember the Bronze Age artists who first captured the essential form in stone, the anonymous builders of the Needham boat who perfected the clinker technique, the countless generations of coastal people who understood that survival depended on the ability to read wind and wave, and to build vessels that could dance with the sea rather than fight it. The longship that would terrorize Europe was already there, sleeping in the stone carvings and the bog-preserved planks, waiting only for the historical moment that would call it forth to reshape the map of the medieval world. To understand why the longship took the form it did, you must first understand the world that shaped it. Imagine yourself standing on the western coast of Norway, where the land meets the sea not in gentle beaches but in a maze of granite fingers stretching deep into the interior. Here, the Atlantic has carved a coastline so intricate, so fractured by fjords and sounds and hidden waterways, that the distance between any 2 points by land might be 10 times the distance by water. This is a landscape that teaches patience to those who would master it, but rewards that patience with passages invisible to those who think only in terms of roads and straight lines. The fjords themselves are marvels of geological architecture, carved by glaciers that retreated millennia ago, but left behind corridors of deep water reaching far inland, some penetrating more than 100 miles into what appears from a distance to be solid, mountainous terrain. Stand at the mouth of the Sognefjord, and you are looking down a waterway that stretches deeper into Norway than the distance from London to Birmingham, yet remains navigable by seagoing vessels almost to its end. The water here runs dark and still, protected by towering walls of stone that rise sometimes directly from the water's edge to heights that dwarf any human construction. But Norway's coastline offers more than just these dramatic deep-water passages. Between the major fjords lie countless smaller waterways, sounds and straits and protected channels that thread between islands and peninsulas like a maritime labyrinth. This is the world of the Skerry, the low rocky island that appears at low tide and vanishes at high water, creating a navigation challenge that demands intimate local knowledge and vessels capable of threading between obstacles that shift with the rhythm of the tides. Only a ship of shallow draft and responsive handling could hope to navigate these waters safely, and only a people raised among such challenges could develop the maritime skills necessary to exploit them. Move eastward from Norway's Atlantic coast, and you encounter the gentler but no less complex waterways of Denmark and southern Sweden. Here, the Baltic Sea penetrates the land through broad sounds and sheltered bays, creating a maritime highway that connects not just the Scandinavian kingdoms, but extends eastward toward the great rivers of Russia and southward toward the trading cities of the German coast. The waters here run shallower than the Norwegian fjords but offer their own challenges, shifting sandbanks, tidal races and seasonal ice that can trap the unwary navigator for months. The people who inhabited this maritime world developed by necessity a relationship with water that went far deeper than simple transportation. For them, the sea was not a barrier to be crossed, but a medium to be inhabited, as natural and essential as the air they breathed. Settlements clustered not around crossroads, but around harbours, and the rhythm of daily life followed not the sun alone but the tides, the seasonal patterns of wind, and the migration routes of the fish that provided both sustenance and trade goods. This intimacy with water created a culture uniquely suited to the development of sophisticated watercraft. While inland peoples might consider a boat a specialised tool, used occasionally for specific purposes, the coastal communities of Scandinavia lived in boats as much as houses. Children learned to handle oars before they learned to ride horses, and the skills of reading wind and current became as fundamental as the ability to judge soil or weather. In such a society, the refinement of ship design was not left to specialised craftsmen alone, but became a collective endeavour, with every sailor contributing observations about how a hull behaved in different conditions, how a sail drew in various winds, how a steering oar responded to the helmsman's touch. The forests that covered much of Scandinavia provided the raw materials for this maritime culture. Here grew oak and pine in seemingly endless profusion, timber of a quality and size that would become legendary among medieval shipbuilders. The oak in particular possessed qualities that made it ideal for ship construction. Dense, strong wood that could be split along the grain to create planks that preserved the natural strength of the tree, resistant to rot when properly treated, flexible enough to bend without breaking under the stress of heavy seas. But perhaps most importantly, the Scandinavian landscape offered something that many other regions lacked: a transportation network where water routes were not just useful but essential. While much of medieval Europe developed around overland trade routes, the broken, mountainous terrain of Norway and the island-dotted waters of Denmark and Sweden created conditions where sea travel was not merely convenient, but often the only practical means of moving people and goods over any significant distance. Consider the simple logistics of moving a cargo of trade goods from Bergen to Trondheim by land versus by sea. The overland route would require navigating mountain passes that might be blocked by snow for months of the year, crossing rivers swollen by spring melt, and following paths that were little more than tracks through wilderness, where a loaded wagon might advance only a few miles per day. The sea route, by contrast, offered a protected coastal passage that could be covered by a well-handled ship in a matter of days, carrying far more cargo with far less risk and expense. This geographic reality created powerful incentives for the development of vessels that could exploit the unique advantages of Scandinavian waters: the ability to penetrate deep into the interior via fjords and rivers, to navigate safely among the countless islands and skerries of the Baltic approaches, to beach on any convenient shore without need for constructed harbours, and to carry both people and cargo efficiently across distances that would challenge any land-based transport system. The longship, when it finally emerged in its mature form, represented the perfect adaptation to this maritime environment. It was not simply a boat that happened to be built in Scandinavia, but a vessel that could only have been conceived by people whose entire worldview had been shaped by the peculiar demands and opportunities of northern European waters. You're standing in a forest clearing somewhere in medieval Scandinavia, perhaps in the hills above Bergen or in the oak groves that once covered much of Denmark. The morning mist still clings to the ground, and you can hear the distant ring of axes echoing through the trees. This is where the longship begins. Not in the shipyard, not on the slipway, but here among the living trees, where craftsmen move through the forest with eyes trained by generations of experience to recognise the perfect timber for their purpose. The shipwright approaches an oak that has been growing here for perhaps 2 centuries. Its trunk rises straight and true for 30 feet before the first major branch, its bark scarred by decades of storms but showing no signs of rot or weakness. This tree has been marked for months, perhaps years, watched through the seasons as the craftsman waits for the perfect moment to fell it. That moment comes in late autumn or winter, when the sap has retreated deep into the roots and the wood has reached its densest, strongest state. You feel the first bite of the broad axe into the heartwood, that moment when steel meets the accumulated strength of decades. The Viking Age shipwright works with tools that would seem almost primitive to modern eyes: axes of various sizes, adzes for smoothing and shaping, wedges for splitting, and simple iron chisels for detail work. But in skilled hands, these basic implements can transform raw timber with a precision that power tools often cannot match. The craftsman understands something that industrial sawing has largely forgotten. Wood is not a uniform material, but a living structure, and working with its grain rather than against it produces timber of extraordinary strength and resilience. Watch as the felled oak is prepared for splitting. Rather than sawing the trunk into lumber, which would cut across the wood's natural fibres and weaken the resulting planks, the Viking shipwright splits the timber radially, following the growth rings from the centre of the tree outward. Each wedge driven into the heartwood follows lines of weakness that nature herself created, separating the wood along boundaries that have existed since the tree was a sapling. The result is planks that retain the full longitudinal strength of the original tree, timber that can flex and bend under stress without breaking. The process demands more than strength. It requires an almost mystical understanding of how wood behaves. The craftsman runs his hands along the surface of each split plank, feeling for irregularities in the grain, checking for hidden knots or weaknesses that might compromise the finished hull. This is wood selection elevated to an art form, where the difference between a seaworthy vessel and a death trap might lie in the proper reading of timber that appears identical to the untrained eye. Different parts of the tree serve different purposes in the finished ship. The long, straight sections of the trunk become the keel and the lower strakes, the crucial planks that will bear the greatest stress when the vessel meets heavy seas. The curved sections where major branches meet the trunk, known as compass timber, are carefully preserved for the natural knees that will connect the ship's ribs to its crossbeams. Nothing is wasted. Even the smaller branches and irregular pieces find their place in the complex three-dimensional puzzle that is a Viking longship. The shaping of each plank requires tools and techniques refined over centuries of maritime construction. The broad axe, wielded with surgical precision, removes the bulk of unwanted wood, following the natural curve and taper that will allow each strake to fit perfectly against its neighbours. The adze, that distinctive curved blade mounted perpendicular to its handle, smooths and refines the surface, creating the subtle compound, curves that give the hull its distinctive shape. In the hands of a master craftsman, the adze moves in long, rhythmic strokes, each cut removing precisely the right amount of material to bring the plank closer to its intended form. You can smell the oak shavings accumulating around the shipwright's feet, that distinctive scent of fresh heartwood that speaks of strength and durability. The wood is still green, still carrying the moisture and flexibility that will make it easier to shape and fit. Working with green timber presents its own challenges. The wood will shrink as it dries, and the craftsman must account for this movement in his calculations, but it also offers advantages impossible to achieve with seasoned lumber. Green oak can be bent to curves that would split dry wood, shaped into the flowing lines that give the longship its distinctive grace. The medieval shipwright carries in his memory the accumulated wisdom of generations. He knows which trees grow the straightest grain, which forests produce the most durable timber, which seasons yield wood with the best working properties. This knowledge cannot be written in books or reduced to simple formulas. It lives in the hands and eyes of the craftsman, passed from master to apprentice through years of patient observation and practice. As each plank takes shape under the steady rhythm of axe and adze, you begin to understand that you're witnessing more than simple woodworking. This is the transformation of living forest into living ship, the marriage of natural growth and human intention that will create a vessel capable of carrying warriors across the North Sea or merchants up the rivers of Russia. The grain of the wood will become the strength of the hull, the growth rings of the tree will become the ribs that flex with Atlantic storms, and the patient wisdom of the forest will become the foundation of an empire that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople. Now we move from the forest to the shore, to that crucial moment when shaped timber begins its transformation into a vessel that will ride the waves. Here, beside some sheltered creek or on the strand of a protected bay, the master shipwright lays out his keel and begins the ancient art of clinker construction. What you're about to witness represents one of humanity's most elegant solutions to the problem of creating a structure that must be simultaneously strong and flexible, watertight and breathable, capable of carrying tons of cargo while drawing less water than a man's height. The secret lies in the overlap. Unlike the smooth-hulled vessels of Mediterranean tradition, where planks meet edge to edge in what shipwrights call carvel construction, the northern European approach layers each strake over the one below it, creating a hull that resembles the overlapping scales of some great wooden fish. This clinker technique, known in Scandinavia as lapstrake building, produces a hull whose strength comes not from massive, internal frameworks but from the planks themselves, each one reinforcing its neighbours in a continuous shell of overlapping timber. Picture the shipwright as he selects the first strake above the keel, a plank perhaps 30 feet long and carefully shaped to follow the subtle curve that will give the hull its distinctive lines. The lower edge of this plank will overlap the keel by perhaps 3 inches, while its upper edge extends beyond the keel's width to provide the foundation for the next course of planking. Along this overlap, the craftsman drills holes with a hand auger, each one placed with the precision that comes from generations of accumulated knowledge about stress and strain, about the forces that will work to tear a ship apart in heavy seas. Through each hole passes an iron rivet, forged in the shipwright's own smithy or obtained from a metal worker whose skill with iron matches the shipbuilder's mastery of wood. These rivets are not the crude spikes that might suffice for land construction, but carefully crafted fasteners, each one formed with a head on one side and fitted with a washer-like disc called a rove on the other. The rove spreads the load of the rivet across a greater area of the wood, preventing the stresses of a working hull from tearing the fastenings through the planks. The spacing of these rivets follows patterns refined over centuries of trial and error. Too few, and the planks will work loose under stress. Too many, and the holes will weaken the wood more than the additional fastenings strengthen it. The master shipwright knows by eye and feel exactly where each rivet should be placed, how deep each hole should be drilled, how tightly each fastening should be set. This is knowledge that cannot be reduced to simple formulas, but must be learned through years of apprenticeship and practice. As each strake is added to the growing hull, you begin to understand the genius of the clinker method. The overlapping planks create longitudinal strength, turning the entire side of the ship into a massive girder, capable of resisting the bending forces that would break a vessel built with lighter scantlings. At the same time, the flexible fastenings allow the hull to work with the waves rather than fight them, twisting and flexing in ways that would destroy a more rigidly constructed vessel. Between the overlapping edges of each strake, the shipwright packs a caulking of tarred wool or rope fibre, creating a seal that will keep the sea outside where it belongs. This caulking must be neither too tight nor too loose. Too much compression, and it will prevent the natural working of the wood. Too little, and water will find its way through. The experienced craftsman judges this by feel, pressing the fibre into place with a caulking iron until it achieves exactly the right degree of compression. The beauty of clinker construction becomes apparent when you consider how the finished hull will behave in a seaway. Where a rigidly built vessel might crack under the alternating stresses of wave and trough, the clinker-built hull flexes like a living thing. The overlapping planks can slide slightly against one another, the iron rivets can adjust to changing loads, and the entire structure can twist and bend within limits that would destroy other forms of construction. This flexibility means that a properly built longship can ride over waves that would overwhelm heavier, more rigid vessels. The technique also offers practical advantages that become apparent only through long experience with northern waters. A clinker-built hull can be easily repaired almost anywhere. A damaged strake can be removed and replaced without major reconstruction, and the overlapping construction makes it simple to judge exactly which planks need attention. The method produces a hull that is remarkably light for its strength, crucial for vessels that must be hauled up beaches or carried over portages between waterways. Perhaps most importantly, clinker construction creates a hull that breathes. The slight movement between planks, the natural expansion and contraction of the wood, the working of the caulking material all combine to create a vessel that remains dry, not through perfect sealing but through a kind of dynamic equilibrium between water entering and water leaving. This seems counterintuitive to modern sensibilities, but it produces vessels of remarkable longevity and seaworthiness. The overlapping strakes create another advantage that becomes crucial in the shallow waters where longships will operate. The stepped profile of the hull's exterior provides natural longitudinal stiffening without the need for heavy internal keelsons or massive frames. This means that the hull can be built lighter and draw less water while maintaining the structural integrity necessary for ocean voyages. As you watch the hull take shape strake by strake, you're witnessing the embodiment of centuries of accumulated wisdom about the behaviour of wood and water, about the eternal struggle between the forces that would drive a ship forward and those that would tear it apart. With the hull planked and the clinker construction complete, we turn to the invisible skeleton that gives the longship its strength, and its characteristic ability to flex with the sea rather than break against it. Here, in the marriage of keel and ribs, of stems and crossbeams, lies perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Viking shipbuilding: the creation of a framework that supports without constraining, that provides structure while preserving the very flexibility that makes these vessels so seaworthy. The keel itself deserves our contemplation, for it represents one of the most challenging pieces of the entire construction. Carved from a single massive oak timber, the keel of a great longship might stretch 70 feet or more from stem to stern, requiring a tree of extraordinary size and perfect straightness. The shipwright who selects such a timber must think generations ahead, for trees of this quality do not appear by accident but represent the culmination of centuries of growth under ideal conditions. The keel serves as more than merely the backbone of the vessel. It is the foundation upon which the entire three-dimensional puzzle of the ship takes shape. Its upper surface is carefully shaped with subtle curves and angles that will determine how each frame sits, how the planking flows, how the finished vessel will move through the water. A poorly shaped keel will create problems that no amount of skilled work elsewhere can correct, while a perfect keel makes every subsequent step in construction proceed with almost magical precision. From the keel rise the curved stems, those graceful upward sweeping timbers that give the longship its distinctive profile. These are not simple straight pieces, but complex curved structures, often carved from naturally curved compass timber, where a major root or branch junction provides the necessary shape. The forward stem must be strong enough to take the pounding of waves in heavy weather, graceful enough to cut cleanly through the water, and perfectly aligned to ensure that the planking meets at exactly the right angle to create a watertight seal. The frames, or ribs, of a longship reveal perhaps the most counterintuitive aspect of Viking construction. Where you might expect to find massive timbers firmly attached to provide maximum rigidity, you instead discover relatively light frames that are deliberately given a degree of freedom to move. The lower sections of many frames are not nailed rigidly to the hull planking, but are instead lashed in place with withies, flexible bands of twisted willow or other pliable wood that allow the frame to shift slightly as the hull works in heavy seas. This flexible attachment represents centuries of accumulated wisdom about the behaviour of wooden vessels in rough water. A rigidly fastened frame would indeed provide greater initial strength, but it would also create points of concentrated stress where the natural working of the hull could eventually cause catastrophic failure. The lashed frames distribute these stresses more evenly, allowing the entire structure to flex as a unit while preventing any single point from bearing more load than it can handle. The crossbeams that tie the port and starboard sides of the hull together present their own engineering challenges. These massive timbers must be strong enough to prevent the sides of the ship from spreading apart under the stress of carrying a full load or fighting heavy seas, yet they must also accommodate the mast step and provide attachment points for the decking and rowing benches. The solution lies in the use of naturally curved knees, L-shaped pieces of timber, cut from the junction of trunk and major branch, that create incredibly strong joints while following the natural grain of the wood. Watch as the shipwright fits one of these knees carefully, shaping the curved timber to mate perfectly with both the crossbeam and the side of the hull. The joint requires no metal fastenings beyond a few carefully placed tree nails, wooden pegs that expand when wet to create a connection stronger than iron. The knee distributes the load of the crossbeam across a wide area of the hull planking, preventing the concentration of stress that could split the side of the vessel. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the longship's framework is how thin the lower planking can be made while still maintaining seaworthiness. In the Gokstad ship, the strakes near the waterline are barely an inch thick, planking that would be considered dangerously light in most modern construction, but which proves perfectly adequate when properly supported by the flexible frame system. This thin planking reduces weight dramatically, while allowing the hull to flex in ways that would be impossible with heavier construction. The secret lies in understanding that strength and rigidity are not the same thing. A rigid structure may seem stronger, but it can only handle stresses up to its breaking point, after which it fails catastrophically. A flexible structure may seem weaker, but it can absorb and redistribute stresses that would destroy a more rigid construction. The longship's framework embodies this principle in every joint and connection. The mast step, where the great pine mast will eventually be seated, represents the ultimate test of the framework's integrity. This single point must bear not only the vertical load of the mast and sail, but also the tremendous lateral forces generated when the wind fills the square sail and tries to push the ship sideways through the water. The solution involves a carefully engineered system of knees, crossbeams, and planking that distributes these forces throughout the entire hull structure. As you examine this framework, you begin to understand that you're looking at something far more sophisticated than simple carpentry. This is structural engineering of the highest order, achieved without the benefit of mathematical analysis or computer modelling, but through centuries of patient observation and refinement. Now the longship must be given its means of propulsion, and here we encounter one of the most elegant solutions in all of maritime history: the marriage of wind and muscle power into a single, seamlessly integrated system. The square sail and the double banks of oars were never competitors in the Viking mind, but partners, each compensating for the other's limitations, together creating a vessel that could harness every advantage the sea offered, while remaining independent of the wind's whims. The sail itself represents a triumph of textile engineering that we too easily overlook in our focus on the ship's timber construction. Woven from the finest wool available, often bleached white or dyed in bold stripes of red and blue, a longship's sail might measure over 100 square meters, when fully spread, a canvas large enough to cover a substantial building. The weaving of such a sail required months of work by skilled craftswomen who understood that their handiwork would face stresses that could tear apart inferior fabric in moments. The wool for these sails came from sheep bred specifically for their long, strong fleece, animals whose wool possessed the combination of flexibility and tensile strength necessary to withstand the enormous forces generated when Atlantic winds filled the square-rigged canvas. The fibres were spun into thread with a twist that balanced strength against flexibility, then woven on massive looms with a density that prevented tearing while remaining light enough for practical handling. The finished cloth was then treated with oils and waxes that provided some degree of water resistance without making the fabric too rigid to fold and stow. When the Gokstad ship was reconstructed and sailed in modern experiments, its estimated sail area of 110 square meters proved capable of driving the vessel at speeds approaching 15 knots in favourable winds, performance that rivals modern racing yachts and far exceeds what most people imagine possible for a medieval craft. The secret lay not just in the size of the sail, but in the sophisticated rigging system that allowed the crew to adjust its shape and angle to capture the maximum possible energy from whatever wind was available. The mast itself stood as a testament to the shipwright's skill in selecting and preparing timber. Cut from a single straight pine that might have taken 2 centuries to grow, the mast of a great longship could stand 40 feet above the deck, bearing not only its own considerable weight, but the enormous stresses generated when the wind struck the sail. The mast step, that crucial joint where the spar meets the hull, required engineering precision that distributed these forces throughout the ship's entire structure. Yet for all the sophistication of the sailing rig, the longship's oars remained its most distinctive feature, the element that truly set these vessels apart from their contemporaries. The Gokstad ship carried 32 oars, each one carefully shaped from a single piece of ashwood and measuring nearly 20 feet in length. When fully manned, 64 hands would grip these oars, 64 sets of muscles would pull in perfect synchronization, driving the ship forward at speeds that sailing vessels of the time could rarely match in light winds. The arrangement of the rowing positions reveals the careful thought that went into every aspect of longship design. The oar ports, those holes cut through the top strake through which the oars extended, were positioned with mathematical precision to ensure that each rower had adequate space while maximizing the power that could be applied to moving the vessel. Each oar port could be sealed with a wooden shutter when the ship was under sail, preventing water from entering while maintaining the hull's streamlined shape. The rowing benches doubled as sea chests, providing storage for each crew member's personal belongings while serving as the platform from which he would pull his oar through countless hours of monotonous labour. This dual purpose reflects the longship's fundamental character as a vessel where every cubic foot of space served multiple functions, where nothing could be included that did not earn its place through practical utility. The coordination required to row a longship effectively demanded training and discipline that transformed a collection of individual warriors into a single, purposeful organism. The stroke had to be maintained not for minutes but for hours, sometimes for days, as the ship made its way up rivers or across open water where winds failed. The rhythm became hypnotic, a meditation of muscle and wood and water that created bonds among the crew as strong as any forged in battle. The steering system represented another marvel of practical engineering. The side-mounted rudder, attached to the starboard quarter, through an ingenious arrangement of leather straps and wooden blocks, provided precise control while remaining easily removable when the ship entered shallow water. The helmsman could lift the entire steering assembly clear of the bottom in seconds, then lower it again when deeper water was reached. This capability proved crucial in the shallow shifting waters of river estuaries, where conventional deep-draft vessels would run aground. The integration of sail and oar reached its ultimate expression in the longship's ability to transition seamlessly between the two modes of propulsion. The mast could be lowered and stowed in minutes when the wind failed, or when stealth required silent approach under oar power alone. The sail could be raised just as quickly when favourable winds returned, allowing the crew to rest their aching muscles while the ship flew across the waves with a grace that seemed almost supernatural to those who witnessed it. Here we encounter perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of longship design, the ability to navigate waters so shallow that no other seagoing vessel of the time could follow. Picture yourself standing on the muddy banks of a river at dawn, watching as the mist rises from water that barely reaches your knees in the deepest channel. To most medieval mariners, such a stream would represent an impassable barrier to anything larger than a fishing boat. Yet from somewhere upstream comes the quiet splash of oars, and gradually a longship emerges from the fog, its crew pulling steadily against the current, its keel cutting through water that seems impossibly shallow for such a substantial vessel. The secret lies in numbers that seem almost impossible until you witness them firsthand. A fully loaded longship carrying perhaps 60 warriors and their equipment draws less water than the height of a tall man. The Gokstad ship, 76 feet long and capable of carrying tons of cargo, requires barely 3 feet of water beneath its keel when fully loaded. This shallow draft transforms every river, every estuary, every tidal creek into a potential highway for Viking expansion. Consider what this meant in practical terms for the geography of medieval Europe. Rivers that seemed safely inland, protected by miles of supposedly impassable shallows, suddenly became vulnerable to attack from the sea. The Seine, winding through the heart of the Frankish kingdom toward Paris, offered no barrier to vessels that could navigate in water barely deeper than a man could wade. The Thames, the Humber, the rivers of Ireland and Scotland all became highways for longships that could penetrate far into territories their victims had considered secure. The engineering that made this possible required a complete rethinking of what a seagoing vessel could be. Traditional shipbuilding wisdom suggested that strength required depth, that a ship needed substantial draft to remain stable in rough water. The longship challenged this assumption with a design that achieved seaworthiness through length rather than depth, stability through beam rather than ballast, strength through flexibility rather than mass. The shallow draft also enabled a tactic that proved psychologically devastating to the longship's opponents: the ability to appear and disappear almost at will. A Viking fleet could beach on any convenient shore, its ships drawing so little water that they could nose right up to the strand and discharge their crews directly onto dry land. No harbour was necessary, no dock or jetty required. The longships could beach almost anywhere along hundreds of miles of coastline, making it impossible for defenders to predict where an attack might come. This beaching capability extended far beyond mere convenience. In rough weather, when deeper draft vessels would be driven onto dangerous lee shores, longships could simply run up onto the nearest beach and wait for conditions to improve. Their crews could haul them completely out of the water if necessary, turning the vessels upside down to provide shelter while repairs were made or storms passed. The relationship between ship and shore became fluid in ways that other maritime traditions never achieved. The ability to navigate rivers opened possibilities that transformed the strategic situation across northern Europe. Viking crews learned to read the subtle signs that indicated navigable water, the colour and flow of currents, the flight patterns of waterfowl, the types of vegetation along the banks. They developed techniques for feeling their way up unfamiliar rivers, using long poles to probe ahead for channels deep enough to float their shallow draft vessels. Rivers also provided natural highways for penetrating deep into continental Europe. The Rhine system gave access to the heart of the Frankish Empire. The Russian rivers, the Dnieper, the Don, the Volga offered routes that connected the Baltic to the Black Sea and the Caspian, opening trade routes that stretched from Scandinavia to Constantinople and Baghdad. The Longship's shallow draft made it possible to navigate these waterways far upstream, sometimes requiring only portages of a few miles between river systems to open entirely new regions to Viking influence. The speed of river travel in a longship could be startling to those unfamiliar with the technique. With 30 or more oars pulling in rhythm, a longship could maintain a steady pace upstream against currents that would stop sailing vessels dead. The crews developed rotation systems that kept fresh rowers on the benches while allowing others to rest, enabling sustained progress over distances that would exhaust less organised efforts. Yet perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the longship's river capability was its silence. Under oar power in still water, a well-handled longship moved with ghost-like quiet, the only sounds the gentle splash of oar blades and the whisper of water along the hull. In the pre-dawn hours, when mist clung to the water and sound carried strangely, such a vessel could approach within arrow shot of its target before anyone on shore realised the danger. This combination of shallow draft, beaching capability, and silent approach created a new form of maritime warfare that existing defences were powerless to counter. The longship had transformed every waterway into a potential invasion route, every shoreline into a vulnerable frontier. The popular imagination tends to conjure a single image when we speak of Viking ships. The sleek, predatory longship cutting through dark waters under a striped sail, its dragon prow reaching toward some distant shore. Yet this singular vision obscures a more complex reality, for the Vikings possessed not one ship type but an entire fleet of specialised vessels, each evolved to meet specific demands of trade, warfare, exploration, and daily transportation across the maritime world of medieval Scandinavia. The Longship, the vessel that most closely matches our popular conception, represented the apex of warship design. These were the greyhounds of the Viking fleet, long, narrow, and built for speed above all other considerations. The great Longships stretched up to 100 feet in length while maintaining beams of barely 15 feet, creating vessels of extraordinary slenderness that could slice through the water with minimal resistance. Their crews might number 70 or 80 men, each one both warrior and oarsman, capable of propelling the ship at speeds that could outrun pursuit or close with prey before escape was possible. Yet for all their fearsome reputation, the Longships represented only one branch of a diverse family tree. At the other extreme lay the Gnar, those broad-beamed workhorses of Viking commerce that carried the mundane but essential cargo of trade and colonisation. Where a Longship might measure 10 times, longer than its beam, a Gnar compressed that ratio to perhaps 4-1, sacrificing speed for the carrying capacity that made long-distance trade profitable and overseas settlement possible. The Gnar's proportions reflected entirely different priorities from its warlike cousins. These vessels needed to carry not warriors but families, not weapons but livestock, not the equipment of raid but the tools and supplies necessary to establish new communities in distant lands. The archaeological evidence from Skulderlev reveals Gnars capable of carrying 15 tons of cargo while still maintaining the shallow draft and flexible construction that allowed them to navigate the rivers and coastal waters of the Viking world. Between these extremes lay a spectrum of intermediate types, each representing a different balance of speed, capacity, and specialization. The Snekja, whose name derived from the Old Norse word for snake, offered something between the pure speed of the Longship and the carrying capacity of the Gnar. These vessels might stretch 60 feet in length, with crews of 30 to 40 men, fast enough for raiding yet substantial enough for coastal trading voyages. The Karvi occupied yet another niche in this taxonomy of ships, smaller than the Snekja but larger than the simple ferry boats that moved people and goods across fjords and between islands. With perhaps 20 pairs of oars, a Karvi could serve as a coastal patrol vessel, a messenger ship, or escort for larger trading expeditions. The variety of names that survive in Old Norse sources, Birding, Fearing, Driki, and dozens of others suggests a richness of specialized types that we can only partially reconstruct from archaeological evidence. This diversity of vessel types reflected the sophistication of Viking maritime culture, a society that had developed not just one solution to the challenges of northern European waters, but a complete toolkit of hulls suited to every conceivable task. A Viking chieftain planning an expedition could select from this range of options with the precision of a modern naval architect, choosing exactly the right combination of speed, capacity and seaworthiness for his intended purpose. The implications of this variety become clear when we consider how Viking fleets actually operated. Rather than consisting of identical vessels, a typical expedition might combine several different ship types to maximize effectiveness. Fast longships provided reconnaissance and pursuit capability, their speed allowing them to scout ahead of the main force or chase down fleeing opponents. Canals carried the bulk supplies, spare equipment and support personnel that any substantial expedition required. Intermediate types filled gaps in capability, providing flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. This mixed fleet concept represented a level of tactical sophistication that we often overlook in our focus on individual ship design. The Vikings had developed not just superior vessels, but superior systems for employing those vessels in combination. A raiding fleet might use its fastest ships to strike coastal targets, while its cargo vessels remained safely offshore, ready to receive plunder or evacuate personnel if resistance proved stronger than expected. The diversity of ship types also reveals the breadth of activities that we too casually group under the label of Viking expansion. The langskip that carried raiders to Lindisfarne represented only the most visible aspect of a maritime culture that also produced the Nars that carried colonists to Iceland, the trading vessels that connected Greenland to Norway, and the exploration ships that pushed beyond the known world to establish settlements in North America. Let us step away from the harbour and the completed vessel to witness the slow miracle of creation itself. Picture yourself in a shipyard somewhere along the Norwegian coast, perhaps in the sheltered waters of the Oslofjord where the famous burial ships were built. The morning sun slants through the mist rising from the water, illuminating a scene of patient craftsmanship that has been repeated here for generations. This is where individual timbers become transformed into something greater than the sum of their parts, where the accumulated wisdom of centuries guides every cut, every joint, every decision in the long journey from raw wood to finished longship. The process begins with the laying of the keel, that crucial backbone around which everything else will take shape. The master shipwright has selected his timber with care, a single oak log perhaps 70 feet in length, straight and true, cut from a tree that may have grown for 2 centuries before reaching the perfection necessary for this purpose. You watch as he marks the subtle curves and angles that will determine the character of the finished vessel, using patterns passed down through generations of builders, templates that exist not on parchment, but in the collective memory of the craft. The keel is positioned on wooden blocks that hold it at exactly the right height and angle, creating a foundation so precise that every subsequent step will depend upon its accuracy. Around this central spine, the shipyard begins to take on the organised chaos of serious construction. Piles of split oak planks age in the salt air, each one marked for its eventual position in the hull. Stacks of naturally curved compass timber wait to become the knees and frames that will give the ship its strength. Iron rivets, forged in the smithy that glows like a jewel at the edge of the yard, cool in neat rows, each one shaped by hand to specifications refined over centuries of trial and error. The stem posts rise next, those graceful curved timbers that will give the longship its distinctive profile. Carved from single pieces of naturally curved oak, these massive timbers require the skills of both shipwright and sculptor. You can see the craftsman working with adze and draw knife, following the grain of the wood as he shapes the complex curves that must mate perfectly with both keel and planking. Each cut is deliberate, considered, tested against templates that exist only in his experienced eye. As the framework takes shape, the true complexity of the project becomes apparent. This is not simply a matter of assembling pre-cut pieces, but of creating a 3-dimensional puzzle where every element must work in harmony with every other element. The curve of each plank must complement the angle of the stems, the spacing of the frames must accommodate the natural taper of the hull, the position of every rivet must be calculated to provide maximum strength without weakening the wood. You watch as the first strakes are fitted, those crucial planks that will establish the shape of everything that follows. The shipwright marks each plank individually, holding it in position while he scribes the exact curve it must follow. No 2 planks are identical, each must be shaped to fit its specific position in the hull, reflecting the subtle compound curves that give the longship its flowing lines and remarkable seaworthiness. The rhythm of construction follows patterns as old as the craft itself. Morning hours are spent on the heavy work of shaping and positioning timber, when arms are fresh and eyes are sharp for the precision required. Afternoons bring the careful fitting and fastening, the painstaking work of drilling holes and driving rivets that will hold the ship together through decades of service. Evening light finds the craftsman caulking seams and smoothing joints, preparing each day's work for the next day's additions. The shipyard becomes a community within itself, drawing skilled workers from throughout the region. The master shipwright directs the overall project, his eye trained by decades of experience to see problems before they develop, to judge the quality of timber and the accuracy of joints. Beneath him work the specialist craftsmen, the men who shape the heavy timbers, the metalworkers who forge the iron fastenings, the carvers who create the decorative elements that transform a working vessel into a thing of beauty. As weeks pass into months, the skeleton of the ship begins to assume its final form. The hull planking creeps upward, strake by strake, each one adding to the growing strength and grace of the vessel. The complex curves that seemed impossible to achieve with simple hand tools emerge naturally from the patient accumulation of precisely fitted pieces. You begin to understand that you are witnessing not just construction, but a kind of wooden alchemy, the transformation of forest materials into something that will live and breathe with the rhythm of the sea. The mast step is fitted with ceremonies of precision that reflect its crucial importance to the vessel's integrity. This single joint must bear forces that could tear apart a lesser structure, distributing the enormous loads generated by wind and sail throughout the entire framework of the ship. Now we must step back from the individual vessel to understand the system that made the longship not just a remarkable piece of technology, but a transformative force in medieval politics. Behind every ship that appeared on the horizon, behind every fleet that materialized from the northern mists, lay an organizational structure as sophisticated as the vessels themselves. This was the Leidang, the maritime levy system that could transform scattered coastal communities into unified naval powers capable of projecting force across vast distances. The Leidang represented one of the earliest examples of systematic naval administration in medieval Europe, a framework that distributed the enormous costs and responsibilities of maintaining a war fleet across the entire society. Under this system, coastal districts were divided into ship soaks, administrative units responsible for building, equipping and manning specific vessels. The size of each district was calculated not by simple geography, but by the complex mathematics of population, resources, and agricultural productivity necessary to support a longship and its crew. Picture the careful surveys that made this system possible. Royal officials travelled the coast, recording the number of farms in each area, assessing the quality of agricultural land, noting the availability of suitable timber for shipbuilding and the presence of skilled craftsmen. Each ship soak represented a delicate balance, large enough to support the substantial costs of maintaining a warship, small enough that the burden did not exceed the community's capacity to bear it without causing economic collapse. The responsibilities of each district extended far beyond simply providing money or materials. The ship soak was obligated to construct and maintain a specific vessel according to precise specifications laid down by royal decree. The longship built by each district had to meet minimum standards for length, beam, crew capacity and seaworthiness. Royal inspectors would periodically examine these vessels, ensuring that local communities were not cutting corners or providing substandard ships that might compromise the effectiveness of the entire fleet. But the system demanded more than ships. Each district was required to provide a full crew of trained fighting men, equipped with weapons, armour and provisions for extended campaigns. These were not hastily assembled militias, but professional warriors who understood their roles not just as fighters, but as sailors, capable of handling the complex tasks required to operate a longship effectively. The Leidang thus created a reserve of maritime military expertise distributed throughout the coastal regions, ready to be activated when royal authority required naval power. The seasonal rhythm of the Leidang reflected the agricultural cycle that supported it. Spring and early summer, when farm work was manageable, became the traditional campaigning seasons. The system allowed for rapid mobilization of substantial fleets, as messages spread along established networks calling up the ships and crews from dozens of districts simultaneously. Within weeks, hundreds of vessels could gather at designated assembly points, creating naval forces that dwarfed anything their opponents could field. The ownership patterns of these vessels reveal the social complexity underlying the ladang system. While the ship soaks provided the resources for construction and maintenance, the actual ownership often remained with local chieftains or wealthy farmers, who held the responsibility for organising their district's contribution. This created a powerful class of maritime aristocrats whose wealth and status derived directly from their ability to build and maintain warships, binding their interests closely to the expansion of royal naval power. The system also fostered innovation and competition among districts. Communities took pride in the quality of their vessels, and the periodic royal inspections created incentives for continuous improvement in design and construction techniques. Districts that produced particularly successful ships gained prestige and sometimes reduced obligations, while those that provided substandard vessels faced increased scrutiny and possible penalties. The ladang transformed the economic landscape of Scandinavia by creating sustained demand for the specialized skills and materials required for shipbuilding. Entire industries developed to serve the system. Iron production for the thousands of rivets required by each vessel, rope making for rigging, textile production for sails, and the complex network of timber merchants who could identify and supply the specific types of wood required for different parts of ship construction. This naval infrastructure also facilitated peaceful activities that extended far beyond warfare. The same organizational networks that could rapidly assemble military fleets also supported trading expeditions, diplomatic missions, and the large-scale colonization efforts that carried Scandinavian settlers to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually North America. The ladang system had created not just military capability, but the administrative and logistical framework for maritime expansion in all its forms. Perhaps most significantly, the system created a shared maritime culture that transcended local boundaries and tribal divisions. The standardization of ship designs, the common training of crews, and the regular interaction between different districts during fleet assemblies gradually forged a unified Scandinavian naval tradition. Warriors from different regions learned to work together on the same vessels, sharing techniques and developing the coordination necessary for complex naval operations. Now we must understand how Europe first experienced this revolutionary maritime technology, not as an abstract innovation, but as a lived reality that transformed the rhythm of medieval life along every vulnerable coastline. The longship announced its arrival not with fanfare, but with a silence that gradually gave way to comprehension, then to terror, as communities that had considered themselves safely inland discovered that the sea could reach them after all. Picture yourself in a monastery scriptorium on the island of Lindisfarne in the year 793. The June morning unfolds with the familiar rhythms that have governed religious life here for generations. The call to prayer echoing across the tidal flats, the scratch of quills on parchment as monks copy sacred texts, the distant sound of waves against the rocky shore that has always seemed more barrier than highway. Then comes a different sound, almost too faint to register at first. The splash of oars moving in unison, the whisper of keels cutting through shallow water where no seagoing vessel should be able to navigate. The psychological impact of these early encounters extended far beyond their immediate physical consequences. For centuries, European communities had organized themselves around assumptions about geography and distance that the longship rendered obsolete overnight. Rivers that had served as natural boundaries now became invasion routes. Coastal settlements that had prospered from their maritime connections discovered that the same waters that brought trade could carry destruction. Islands that had seemed like natural fortresses found themselves transformed into isolated targets with no means of escape. The chroniclers who recorded these events struggled to find language adequate to describe what they witnessed. Their accounts speak repeatedly of ships appearing like dragons, or as if from nowhere. Language that suggests not just surprise but a fundamental challenge to their understanding of how the world worked. These were not simply foreign raiders, but representatives of an entirely different relationship with the sea, one that allowed them to move through European waters with a freedom that seemed almost supernatural to those who witnessed it. The strategic implications of the longship's capabilities became apparent through a series of increasingly ambitious penetrations into what had been considered secure territory. The attack on Lindisfarne demonstrated that even islands could be reached, but subsequent raids revealed far more troubling possibilities. When longships appeared on the Seine, carrying their crews to the very gates of Paris, they announced that no river was too shallow, no inland target too distant to be considered safe from seaborne attack. The response of European rulers to this new threat reveals both the effectiveness of longship technology and the limitations of existing defensive strategies. Traditional fortifications designed to protect against land-based armies proved inadequate against attackers who could bypass them entirely by approaching from unexpected directions. Coastal defences that might have deterred conventional naval forces were useless against vessels that could beach almost anywhere and whose crews could retreat to the safety of shallow water at the first sign of organised resistance. Perhaps most unsettling was the way longship raids challenged existing notions of time and distance. A monastery might receive warning that Viking ships had been seen hundreds of miles away, only to find those same vessels at their gates within days. The speed with which longships could move, particularly when combining sail and oar power, compressed European geography in ways that made traditional defensive planning obsolete. By the time messengers could carry word of an approaching fleet, that fleet might already have struck and departed. The psychological warfare aspects of longship operations were as carefully calculated as their technical capabilities. The ability to appear without warning, to strike at targets that had never before been vulnerable to seaborne attack, created a climate of uncertainty that extended far beyond the immediate victims of any particular raid. Communities began to organize their lives around the possibility of sudden attack from the sea, posting lookouts, preparing evacuation plans, and abandoning exposed positions that had been occupied for generations. The economic disruption caused by longship raids extended far beyond the immediate damage inflicted during any single attack. The mere possibility that Viking ships might appear at any moment made it dangerous to engage in the routine activities that sustained medieval life, tending fields near the coast, operating mills along riverbanks, maintaining the network of small ports and landing places that facilitated local trade. The longship had weaponized uncertainty itself, turning the sea from a highway of commerce into a source of perpetual anxiety. Let us now step aboard one of these vessels and experience what it meant to live and work within the cramped, demanding world of a longship crew. You find yourself settling onto a sea chest that serves as both your rowing bench and your only personal storage space aboard this 70-foot vessel. The chest beneath you contains everything you own beyond the clothes on your back, a spare cloak, perhaps a small knife, a few coins wrapped in leather, and whatever trinkets or tools define your identity beyond your role as one of 32 oarsmen who will propel this ship across unknown waters. The organisation of space aboard a longship reveals itself as a masterpiece of efficiency born from absolute necessity. Every cubic foot serves multiple purposes, every object has its designated place, and every man understands his position in a hierarchy that governs not just social relationships, but the physical arrangement of life aboard the vessel. You sit in the order, determined by your status and experience, with the most seasoned warriors occupying the positions near the stern where the steering decisions are made and the ship's treasure is stored. Your oar, nearly 20 feet of carefully shaped ash wood, represents both your primary responsibility and your claim to a share in whatever fortunes await. The rhythm of rowing becomes the heartbeat of the ship, a cadence that must be maintained not for minutes or hours, but sometimes for days, as the longship makes its way up rivers or across open water where the wind provides no assistance. You learn to pull in perfect synchronization with your shipmates, 32 oars moving as one, creating the hypnotic splash and recovery that propels the vessel forward at speeds that surprise even experienced sailors. The rowing shifts develop their own social dynamics, with crews rotating through periods of intense labour and relative rest according to patterns refined through generations of sea voyaging. During your time on the oar, the world narrows to the rhythm of pull and recovery, the burn in your shoulders and back, the need to maintain perfect timing with the man behind you and the man in front. When your shift ends, you remain in your same position but turn your attention to other tasks, mending equipment, preparing food, or simply resting in whatever comfort can be found on the hard wooden deck. The shield rack that runs along the gunwale serves purposes beyond mere storage for your weapons. These round wooden shields, painted in bright colours and bearing the symbols of your home district, create a visual barrier that helps define the ship's interior space, while providing some protection from spray and weather. During storms, additional cloaks and canvas can be rigged between the shields to create primitive but essential shelter for a crew that must live entirely in the open air. Food aboard a longship reflects the limitations of a vessel with no cooking facilities and minimal storage space. Your meals consist primarily of dried fish, hard bread that must be soaked in water or ale to become edible, and whatever fresh provisions can be obtained during brief stops ashore. Water, stored in leather containers that must be carefully monitored and rationed, becomes more precious than silver on long voyages. The constant dampness, the salt spray, and the rolling motion of the ship combine to create an environment where simple comfort becomes a luxury beyond price. Sleep on a longship represents perhaps the greatest challenge of all. You make your bed on the hard deck, using your sea chest as a pillow and your cloak as both mattress and blanket. The ship never truly stops moving, even when anchored, and you learn to sleep in rhythm with the vessel's motion, your body unconsciously adjusting to every roll and pitch. On cold nights, crews huddle together for warmth, sharing body heat in arrangements that transcend normal social boundaries and create bonds of mutual dependence. The navigation of a longship relies on skills and knowledge that exist entirely in the minds and senses of the most experienced crew members. There are no charts, no compass, no instruments beyond the accumulated wisdom of men who have learned to read the subtle signs that reveal position and direction. You watch the navigator judge distance by the flight of seabirds, estimate current by the colour and temperature of the water, and determine direction by the angle of swells, even when stars and sun are hidden by clouds. Now we turn our gaze to the horizons that called to these remarkable vessels, following the longships as they pushed beyond the familiar waters of Scandinavia to the very edges of the known world. The same technological capabilities that made river raids possible also opened oceanic distances that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations of seafarers. The shallow draft that allowed penetration of inland waterways, the flexible construction that survived Atlantic storms, and the dual propulsion system that provided independence from wind patterns, combined to create vessels capable of voyages that expanded the medieval world's conception of what lay beyond the sunset. The settlement of Iceland represents perhaps the most systematic demonstration of longship capabilities applied to peaceful expansion. Beginning in the 870 years, Norwegian settlers used these vessels to transport not just themselves, but entire communities across 600 miles of North Atlantic waters. The nars that carried these colonists bore livestock, agricultural tools, household goods, and all the material necessities of establishing civilization in an uninhabited land. The voyage itself, while dangerous, proved routine enough that thousands of families made the crossing, creating a transplanted Scandinavian society that maintained continuous contact with the homeland through regular ship traffic. From Iceland, the next leap required crossing another 300 miles of increasingly hostile waters to reach Greenland. Here, the margins of survival grew narrower, the distances greater, and the consequences of navigational error potentially fatal. Yet longships and their broader-beamed cousins proved equal to the challenge, establishing settlements along Greenland's western coast that endured for centuries. The very existence of these communities depended entirely on the maritime technology that connected them to the outside world, carrying supplies they could not produce locally, and taking away the walrus ivory and other Arctic products that justified the enormous costs and risks of maintaining such remote outposts. The westward push did not end with Greenland. Archaeological evidence now confirms what the sagas long claimed, that Scandinavian explorers reached North America itself, establishing at least temporary settlements on the coast of what we now call Newfoundland. The distances involved in these voyages strain credibility until we remember the capabilities of the vessels that made them possible. A well-found nar could carry sufficient supplies for months at sea, while maintaining the shallow draft necessary to explore unknown coastlines and the flexibility to survive the storms that could destroy more rigid vessels. But westward expansion represented only one direction of longship exploration. To the east, these same vessels opened entirely different possibilities, carrying Scandinavian merchants and warriors down the rivers of Russia toward the great trading cities of the Black Sea and beyond. The Dnieper route, from the Baltic to Constantinople, required navigating nearly 2,000 miles of rivers, lakes, and portages, yet regular traffic developed along this waterway, creating commercial connections that linked Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire and through it to the Islamic world beyond. The eastern routes demanded different skills from the western voyages, but relied on the same fundamental longship capabilities. The ability to beach anywhere and drag vessels overland during portages proved essential for navigating between river systems. The shallow draft that made river travel possible also allowed exploration of tributaries and backwaters that might harbour trading opportunities or threats. The combination of oars and sail provided the flexibility necessary to adapt to the varying conditions encountered along routes that might include everything from open lakes to narrow, swift-flowing streams. These eastern expeditions established trading networks that carried Scandinavian amber and furs south, in exchange for silver, silk and spices that found their way back to markets in Bergen and Copenhagen. The scale of this commerce can be measured in the thousands of Islamic silver coins that archaeologists have discovered in Scandinavian hoards, each one representing a link in commercial chains that stretch from the Baltic to Baghdad. The longships that made this trade possible were simultaneously enabling cultural exchanges that would influence everything from art and religion to military technology and political organisation. The navigational challenges of these long-distance voyages pushed Scandinavian seamanship to its limits. Without charts or instruments, navigators relied on accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. The behaviour of specific bird species that indicated proximity to land, the characteristics of ocean swells that revealed direction even when sun and stars were obscured, the subtle changes in water colour and temperature that suggested currents and depths. This knowledge existed entirely in human memory, making each experienced navigator a repository of geographical information that could not be easily replaced if lost. Yet even these remarkable vessels, for all their sophisticated engineering and proven seaworthiness, remained fundamentally vulnerable to forces beyond human control. The longship represented the pinnacle of wooden shipbuilding technology, but it was still wood, still dependent on the skills and vigilance of its crew, still subject to the inexorable processes of decay and the unpredictable violence of northern seas that could destroy the most carefully crafted vessel in moments. The maintenance demands of a longship fleet were staggering in their scope and complexity. Wood, even the finest oak split along the grain and seasoned to perfection, remained a living material that continued to move and change, long after the tree from which it came had been felled. The constant working of a hull in seaways gradually loosened even the most carefully driven rivets, opened seams that had been perfectly caulked, and created the slow leaks that could transform a seaworthy vessel into a waterlogged liability, if not addressed with constant vigilance. The seasonal rhythm of longship maintenance reflected this ongoing battle against entropy. Each autumn, as the campaigning season ended and the worst of the winter storms approached, ships were hauled up onto beaches or into specially constructed sheds where crews could address the accumulated damage of months at sea. Planks that had worked loose were refastened, caulking that had been washed out was replaced, and rivets that showed signs of corrosion were pulled and renewed. The tar that protected the hull from shipworm and rot required regular renewal, a process that filled shipyards with the acrid smoke of heating pitch and the patient labour of men applying protective coatings plank by plank. Winter storage presented its own challenges, for a longship was designed to be supported by water along its entire length, not to rest on land where its own weight could create stresses that the flexible construction was never meant to bear. Careful placement of supports, regular inspection for signs of hogging or sagging, and the constant vigilance required to prevent rot in timber that was no longer washed by salt water made winter maintenance as demanding as any sea voyage. The evidence of shipwreck sites scattered throughout Scandinavian waters tells a sobering story of the limits of even the most advanced medieval maritime technology. Archaeological investigation of these underwater graveyards reveals vessels that were clearly seaworthy when they sailed, but succumbed to combinations of circumstances that overwhelmed their crew's ability to respond. Some show evidence of structural failure, where the flexible construction that normally provided strength instead became a weakness under extreme loads. Others reveal signs of navigational error, vessels driven onto rocks or sandbars by storms that confused even experienced helmsmen. The human cost of these limitations emerges most clearly in the skeletal remains sometimes found with wrecked vessels, testimony to crews who died not from enemy action, but from the simple failure of wood and rope to withstand forces that exceeded their design parameters. The sagas speak of ships that simply disappeared, vessels that sailed from known, harbours with experienced crews, and were never seen again, their fate remaining unknown until centuries later, when shifting sands or changing currents revealed their remains. Weather patterns in the North Atlantic created seasonal windows of relative safety that compressed the sailing season into a few precious months when storms were less frequent, and daylight lasted long enough for navigation by natural signs. Outside these windows, even the most seaworthy longship became vulnerable to conditions that could overwhelm any wooden vessel. The short summer sailing season meant that long-distance voyages required careful timing and often involved overwintering in foreign ports, creating logistical challenges that multiplied the risks and costs of maritime expansion. The gradual accumulation of small failures could prove as deadly as any single catastrophic event. A rivet that worked loose in a storm, caulking that washed out of a critical seam, a steering oar that cracked under stress, any of these minor problems could cascade into major emergencies if they occurred far from shore or in weather that prevented effective repairs. The flexibility that made longship construction so successful also meant that failures rarely occurred in isolation. Damage to one part of the hull created additional stresses elsewhere that could lead to progressive structural collapse. The longship's revolutionary impact on medieval warfare began to diminish as European societies adapted their defensive strategies to counter the advantages that had made these vessels so devastatingly effective. The process unfolded gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, as isolated defensive innovations slowly coalesced into systematic countermeasures that transformed rivers from highways of invasion into corridors of containment. The transformation began with the simplest possible response: the blocking of waterways. When Frankish rulers realized that their great rivers had become invasion routes, they initiated engineering projects on a scale not seen since Roman times. The Edict of Pitre, issued in 864, ordered the construction of fortified bridges across the Seine at strategic points, creating barriers that no longship could bypass. These were not simple spans but complex defensive works, with fortified towers controlling each end and mechanisms for raising sections of the bridge to trap hostile vessels. The engineering challenges of these river fortifications were immense, requiring innovations in both military architecture and hydraulic engineering. The bridges had to be strong enough to withstand the current of major rivers, while remaining flexible enough to be open for friendly traffic. Their approaches required fortification against land-based attacks, while their positions had to be chosen to maximize defensive effectiveness without completely disrupting the river trade that remained essential to medieval commerce. As these fixed defenses proliferated, the strategic situation that had favored longship operations began to reverse. Rivers that had once offered unlimited access to the interior of European kingdoms became increasingly confined corridors where attackers faced predictable defensive positions. The element of surprise, so crucial to Viking success, eroded as defenders could anticipate where attacks were likely to occur and concentrate their forces accordingly. The response extended beyond individual bridges to encompass entire river systems. Along the Thames, the Rhine, and the major waterways of France, a network of fortified positions gradually emerged, each one designed to support the others in creating overlapping fields of defensive fire. These installations included not just bridges but riverside castles, fortified monasteries, and purpose-built naval bases where defensive fleets could be maintained to intercept longships before they could penetrate deep into friendly territory. The development of specialized river warfare tactics accompanied these infrastructure improvements. European commanders learned to use the confined spaces of fortified waterways to their advantage, employing tactics that neutralized the longship's advantages in maneuverability and speed. Chains stretched across rivers at narrow points could halt even the swiftest vessels, while catapults positioned on commanding heights could rain projectiles down on ships trapped between defensive positions. Perhaps most significantly, these defensive innovations forced longship operations into increasingly predictable patterns. Where Viking commanders had once enjoyed almost unlimited freedom in selecting targets and approach routes, they now faced situations where successful attacks required frontal assaults against prepared positions. The longship's greatest strengths, surprise, mobility, and the ability to strike at unexpected points, became largely irrelevant when defenders could channel attackers into predetermined killing grounds. The economic implications of these defensive measures extended far beyond their immediate military effects. The construction and maintenance of river fortifications required sustained investment on a scale that could only be supported by increasingly centralized royal authority. The need to coordinate defensive efforts across entire river systems accelerated the development of more effective governmental institutions, while the costs of permanent fortification created incentives for negotiated settlements rather than continued warfare. The psychological impact proved equally significant. As European defences became more effective, the aura of invincibility that had surrounded longship operations began to dissipate. Defenders who had once felt helpless against seaborne attacks gained confidence as they witnessed Viking fleets turning back from fortified positions or suffering significant losses in attempts to force defended passages. The longship fleets adapted to these changing conditions, but their adaptations revealed the limitations of their technological advantages. Forced to operate in increasingly constrained environments, Viking commanders turned to siege tactics for which their vessels were poorly suited. The same shallow draft that had enabled river penetration became a liability when attacks required sustained operations against fortified positions that could not be bypassed. The transformation reached its logical conclusion with the development of purpose-built defensive fleets designed specifically to counter longship tactics. These vessels, heavier and more heavily armed than their Viking counterparts, sacrificed speed and maneuverability for the ability to fight decisive actions in confined waters. When combined with fixed fortifications that could control the movement of hostile vessels, these defensive fleets created a new strategic environment where the longship's advantages were systematically neutralized. The longship's dominance in northern European waters began to wane, not through sudden defeat, but through the gradual emergence of competing technologies better suited to changing economic and military realities. By the 12th century, a new type of vessel was appearing in increasing numbers along the coasts of the North Sea and Baltic. The cog, a broad-beamed, high-sided cargo ship that challenged every assumption upon which longship design had been based. Where the longship prioritized speed and shallow draft, the cog emphasized cargo capacity and seaworthiness in heavy weather. These vessels, with their distinctive straight stems and stern, their single square sail and their deep, capacious holds, could carry perhaps 10 times the cargo of a longship, while requiring crews only a fraction the size. The economic implications of this difference proved decisive in an era when European trade was expanding beyond the local networks that had sustained earlier centuries. The cog's construction reflected entirely different priorities from those that had shaped longship design. Built with thick, heavy planks joined edge to edge in the carvel tradition, cogs sacrificed the flexibility that had made longships so seaworthy in favour of the structural strength necessary to carry heavy cargoes without deformation. Their deep draft, which would have made river navigation impossible, provided stability in the open ocean that allowed them to operate safely in weather conditions that would have driven longships to seek shelter. The transformation of northern European waters from highways of raid to channels of commerce created conditions where the cog's advantages outweighed its limitations. Merchants who needed to transport bulk cargoes of grain, wool, or timber found that a single cog could accomplish what would have required several knars, while the reduced crew requirements made long-distance trading voyages economically viable in ways that had been impossible with earlier vessel types. The rise of the Hanseatic League accelerated this transformation, creating trading networks that spanned the Baltic and North Sea regions with a regularity and scale that demanded vessels optimized for cargo rather than combat. The great cogs that carried Lübeck's merchants to Bergen, Novgorod and London represented a different relationship with the sea than that embodied in longship design. One based on predictable routes, established ports, and the patient accumulation of commercial profit rather than the swift acquisition of plunder. Military applications evolved in parallel with commercial changes. The high sides of cogs provided natural protection for fighting men, while their capacity allowed them to carry larger crews and heavier weapons than longships could manage. When fitted with wooden towers or castles at bow and stern, cogs became formidable fighting platforms that could dominate engagements with the lower-profile vessels they gradually displaced. The technological shift represented more than simply one ship type replacing another. It reflected fundamental changes in the social and economic structures that had given rise to the longship's dominance. The warrior merchants who had manned Viking expeditions gave way to specialized classes of professional sailors and soldiers whose skills were adapted to different types of vessels and different modes of operation. Regional variations in this transition reveal the complex factors that determined when and how thoroughly older technologies were abandoned. In Norway, where the traditional relationship between ship and shore remained strong, variants of longship construction persisted well into the medieval period, adapted to local conditions and continuing needs. The Scottish Berlin, with its clinker construction and shallow draft, preserved essential longship characteristics while incorporating modifications that reflected centuries of additional development. The persistence of longship techniques in specialized applications demonstrates that technological change rarely involves complete replacement of older methods. Even as cogs dominated bulk trade and naval warfare, situations continued to arise where the unique capabilities of longship design remained advantageous. River navigation, coastal patrol, and operations in shallow or confined waters still favoured vessels that emphasise manoeuvrability over cargo capacity. The gradual nature of this technological transition meant that for several centuries, northern European waters supported a diverse mix of vessel types, each optimised for specific roles within an increasingly complex maritime system. Great cogs carried the bulk cargoes that sustained growing cities, while smaller vessels maintained the local connections that linked rural producers to urban markets. Military fleets combined different ship types to maximise tactical flexibility, much as Viking fleets had done centuries earlier. Yet the underlying economic forces driving this transformation proved inexorable. As European societies became more urbanised, more centralised, and more dependent on long-distance trade, the premium placed on cargo capacity and operational efficiency gradually outweighed the tactical advantages that had made longships so formidable. The age of the swift, shallow-draft raider was giving way to an era of the deep-hulled merchant ship, reflecting a fundamental shift in how northern European societies related to the sea itself. The year 1066 brought to the shores of northern England what would prove to be the last great demonstration of longship power, deployed on the grand scale that had once terrorized Europe. Harald Hardrada's invasion fleet represented the culmination of centuries of Scandinavian maritime expertise, an armada so vast that contemporary sources struggled to convey its magnitude in terms their audiences could comprehend. Yet this massive assemblage of vessels and warriors would also mark the end of an era, the final moment when the longship's unique capabilities could determine the fate of kingdoms. The preparation of Hardrada's expedition required mobilization of resources on a scale that tested the limits of Norwegian royal authority. The Lidang system, refined over generations to support exactly such undertakings, called up ships and crews from every coastal district in the kingdom. The logistics of assembling perhaps 300 vessels, provisioning crews numbering in the tens of thousands, and coordinating their movement across the North Sea represented organizational challenges that pushed medieval administrative capabilities to their breaking point. The fleet that eventually gathered in Norwegian waters embodied the full spectrum of longship technology, perfected over centuries of development. Great warships with crews of 70 or 80 men served as flagships for regional commanders, while smaller vessels provided the flexibility necessary for reconnaissance and communication between the scattered elements of the armada. Supply ships, though fewer in number, carried the weapons, provisions, and siege equipment necessary for sustained campaigning in hostile territory. The crossing to England demonstrated longship capabilities at their most impressive. Hundreds of vessels moving in coordinated formation across the North Sea represented a degree of maritime organisation that no other medieval power could match. The ability to transport an entire army with its equipment and supplies across open ocean in a single operation showcased the culmination of Scandinavian naval development, stretching back to the first experimental voyages carved into Bronze Age rock. Yet even as this great fleet achieved its immediate tactical objectives, landing successfully on English soil and advancing inland to confront the forces of Harold Godwinson, it was operating in a strategic environment that had evolved beyond the conditions that once made longship operations so devastatingly effective. The element of surprise, so crucial to earlier Viking successes, had been lost to the intelligence networks that now connected European courts. The English knew Hardrada was coming, had time to prepare their response, and possessed military technologies that could match Norwegian capabilities on relatively equal terms. The Battle of Stamford Bridge, fought on September 25, 1066, unfolded not as a sudden raid against unprepared opponents, but as a conventional engagement between professional armies of roughly equal strength and equipment. The longship's advantages in mobility and surprise, so crucial to earlier generations of Viking success, played no role in a battle fought far inland on ground chosen by English commanders. The Norwegians fought with the courage and skill that had made their ancestors legendary, but they fought as a conventional medieval army, not as the swift, unpredictable raiders who had once redefined European concepts of military possibility. The aftermath of Stamford Bridge revealed the thoroughness of the Norwegian defeat in numbers that spoke more eloquently than any chronicle description. Of the hundreds of ships that had carried Hardrada's army to England, barely 24 proved necessary to transport the survivors back to Norway. The great longship fleet, assembled at enormous cost and representing the maritime power of an entire kingdom, had been reduced to a handful of vessels carrying the remnants of what had once been a formidable military force. The symbolic significance of this reduction extends beyond mere military defeat to represent the end of an entire era in northern European warfare. The age when superior maritime technology could compensate for numerical disadvantage, when the ability to appear anywhere along hundreds of miles of coastline could offset the strategic advantages of interior position and prepared defences, had come to a close. Future Scandinavian interventions in European affairs would require conventional military capabilities, not the revolutionary maritime advantages that had once made Viking expansion possible. The timing of Hardrada's defeat, occurring just weeks before the Norman invasion at Hastings, seems to suggest that 1066 marked not just the end of Viking military power, but the transition to a new phase of medieval warfare, where different technologies and different strategic concepts would dominate. The longship, which had once revolutionized the military balance of medieval Europe, had become a relic of an earlier age, still formidable within its traditional sphere, but no longer capable of achieving the kind of transformational victories that had once reshaped the map of the medieval world. Let us return now to the ships that first captured our imagination, those vessels that have come to rest not on distant shores, but beneath mounds of earth, transformed from instruments of voyage into monuments of death, the great ship. Burials of Scandinavia, Oseberg, Gokstad, and others scattered throughout the Viking homelands offer us a different perspective on the longship's significance, revealing how these vessels served not only the living, but also the elaborate rituals through which medieval Scandinavian society honoured its most powerful dead. Picture the scene as it must have unfolded sometime in the 9th century. A great longship, perhaps recently returned from successful voyages to distant lands, being hauled up from the water for the final time. But this vessel will not be prepared for winter storage or refitted for another season of sailing. Instead, it will become the centerpiece of a burial ceremony that transforms the ship from a working vessel into a cosmic vehicle, a means of transport not across earthly seas but into the realm of the dead. The Oseberg ship, discovered in 1904 beneath a burial mound in southeastern Norway, carried 2 women into the afterlife with a magnificence that speaks to the extraordinary status these individuals must have held in their living world. The older woman, perhaps in her 70s or 80s, was accompanied by a younger companion, and together they were surrounded by the most elaborate collection of grave goods ever recovered from a Viking Age burial. Carved sledges that might have carried them over winter snows, textiles of incredible fineness, kitchen implements, and personal ornaments, everything necessary to maintain their status and comfort in whatever world awaited beyond death. The Gokstad burial tells a different story, but one equally revealing of the ship's symbolic power. Here, a single man, perhaps 40 or 50 years of age, was interred with his longship, along with horses, dogs, and a full complement of equipment for both war and daily life. The vessel itself, nearly 77 feet in length, represents one of the finest examples of longship construction ever recovered, its preservation in the blue clay of the burial mound so complete that every detail of its sophisticated engineering remains visible to modern eyes. These ship burials force us to confront the reality that the vessels we have been exploring were never simply tools of war or commerce, but held profound spiritual significance in Scandinavian culture. The decision to enter such valuable objects, ships that represented enormous investments of labour, materials, and skilled craftsmanship, suggests beliefs about death and the afterlife that made such sacrifices not just acceptable, but necessary for individuals of the highest social rank. The ritual significance of these burials extends beyond the ships themselves to encompass the entire process of interment. Archaeological evidence suggests that the burial ships were not simply placed in the ground, but were positioned with careful attention to orientation and surrounded by earthworks that created artificial landscapes designed to honour and contain the powerful dead. The burial mounds themselves became permanent features of the cultural landscape, marking the locations where the most significant members of society had made their transition from the world of the living to whatever realm awaited beyond. The grave goods found in these ship burials reveal the complexity of Viking Age society in ways that purely textual sources cannot match. The Oseberg textiles, with their intricate patterns and sophisticated weaving techniques, demonstrate levels of artistic achievement that challenge stereotypical images of Viking culture as crude or primitive. The carved wooden objects, many decorated with elaborate animal motifs that blend Christian and pagan symbolic traditions, show how Scandinavian artisans were adapting to the religious changes that were transforming their world. Perhaps most significantly, these burials demonstrate that the longships we have been examining were not anonymous vessels crewed by faceless raiders, but were associated with specific individuals whose identities and achievements were considered worthy of permanent commemoration. The care with which these ships were prepared for burial, the valuable objects placed aboard them, and the elaborate earthworks constructed to contain them all, speak to a society that understood these vessels as extensions of the people who owned and commanded them. The symbolic power of the ship in death reflects its practical importance in life, but the burial context adds dimensions of meaning that purely functional analysis cannot capture. These vessels served as bridges between worlds, carrying their passengers not just across earthly waters, but across the ultimate boundary that separates life from death. In choosing to bury their most honoured dead in ships, Scandinavian society was acknowledging that the same technology that had enabled their expansion across the known world might also provide safe passage to whatever unknown realm awaited beyond the grave. The longships that had slumbered beneath Scandinavian earth for over a millennium began their return to the modern world through the patient labour of archaeologists working in an age when the scientific study of the past was still finding its methods. The excavation of the Gokstad ship in 1880 represented one of the first systematic attempts to recover and preserve a complete Viking vessel, an undertaking that required techniques and expertise that simply had not existed in earlier periods of antiquarian interest. Picture the scene in that summer of 1880 as Norwegian archaeologist Nikolai Nikolaisen and his team began the delicate work of exposing the ship that had rested in blue clay for nearly 1,000 years. The preservation was so complete that the excavators found themselves looking at planks and rivets that seemed to have been placed yesterday, wood that retained its grain and colour despite the passage of centuries. Every detail of construction that we have been exploring throughout this long journey remained visible. The overlapping strakes of the clinker hull, the carefully shaped curves of stem and stern, the elegant solution of flexible frames lashed to allow the vessel to work with the sea rather than fight it. The impact of these discoveries on contemporary understanding of Viking achievement cannot be overstated. Where earlier generations had relied on fragmentary literary sources and the occasional stray artifact to imagine what these vessels might have looked like, suddenly scholars found themselves confronted with complete examples of medieval shipbuilding at its most sophisticated. The Gokstad ship, in particular, revealed levels of engineering refinement that challenged prevailing assumptions about medieval technology and demonstrated that these were not crude barbarian craft but vessels representing the pinnacle of their era's maritime development. The 1904 excavation of the Oseberg ship added another dimension to this growing understanding, providing not just a vessel, but an entire burial complex that revealed the cultural context within which these ships operated. The elaborate grave goods, the sophisticated artistic traditions evident in the carved objects, and the clear evidence of female power and status challenged romanticized notions of Viking society, while providing concrete evidence for the complex civilization that had produced these remarkable vessels. Perhaps most significantly, the recovery of the Skulderev ships in the 1960s provided not just individual vessels, but an entire cross-section of Viking maritime technology. These 5 ships, deliberately sunk as a barrier across Roskilde Fjord, represented different types and periods of construction, offering archaeologists the opportunity to trace the evolution of design and technique across several centuries of development. From small fishing boats to great warships, the Skuld find revealed the full spectrum of vessels that had once populated Scandinavian waters. The preservation and display of these ships in purpose-built museums created new challenges that pushed the boundaries of conservation science. Waterlogged wood, preserved for centuries in anaerobic conditions, began to deteriorate rapidly when exposed to air and modern environmental conditions. The techniques developed to stabilize and preserve these vessels, involving years of treatment with chemical solutions that gradually replaced the water in the wood, became models for maritime archaeology worldwide. Yet the most remarkable chapter in the modern history of these ancient vessels began when contemporary shipwrights decided not simply to study the archaeological remains, but to build and sail full-scale reconstructions. The Viking ship replica built in 1893 and sailed from Norway to the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago demonstrated that these were not museum pieces, but working vessels capable of oceanic voyages under modern conditions. When this replica crossed the Atlantic under its own power, completing the voyage in 28 days, it provided dramatic confirmation of the seaworthiness that archaeologists had inferred from studying the hull lines and construction techniques. The Sea Stallion from Glendalough, built as a reconstruction of Skuld II and launched in 2007, carried this experimental approach to its logical conclusion by attempting to replicate not just the vessel, but the complete voyage experience. When this 60-foot warship sailed from Roskilde to Dublin, crewed by volunteers using traditional techniques and equipment, it provided modern sailors with direct experience of what life aboard a Viking Longship actually entailed. The knowledge gained from this voyage about sailing characteristics, crew requirements, and the practical challenges of long-distance travel in an open vessel complemented archaeological evidence in ways that neither approach could have achieved alone. As we reach the end of our long journey through the world of the Longship, we must confront the curious paradox of how these vessels live on in modern imagination, simultaneously more famous and less understood than they were in their own time. The Longship has become one of the most recognizable symbols of the medieval world, yet the version that persists in popular culture often bears little resemblance to the sophisticated maritime technology we have been exploring throughout these quiet hours together. The horned helmet, perhaps the most persistent visual symbol associated with Viking culture, provides a perfect example of how historical reality becomes transformed by the needs of later ages. No authentic Viking helmet has ever been discovered with horns, yet this impossible image dominates everything from children's books to major motion pictures. The horned helmet emerged not from archaeological evidence, but from the romantic imagination of 19th century artists, particularly those working on productions of Wagner's Ring Cycle, who believed that barbaric warriors required appropriately savage headgear to match their supposed primitive nature. This process of mythologization reveals as much about the societies that created these myths as it does about the historical Vikings themselves. The romantic movement of the 19th century needed noble savages to contrast with industrial civilization, and the longship crews provided convenient subjects for this projection. Later periods found different uses for Viking imagery, as symbols of Nordic racial superiority, as representations of rugged individualism, or as emblems of rebellion against established authority. Each generation has reshaped the Viking image to serve its own psychological and political needs. Yet beneath these layers of accumulated mythology, the actual accomplishments of longship technology remain genuinely remarkable, perhaps even more impressive when stripped of romantic embellishment than when dressed. In the theatrical costumes that popular culture has provided, the engineering solutions we have examined, the clinker construction that created flexible strength, the shallow draft that opened river highways, the integrated sail and oar systems that provided unprecedented maritime mobility, represent innovations that expanded the boundaries of the possible in their time and influenced shipbuilding traditions that persisted for centuries afterward. The Longship's true legacy lies not in the raids and battles that capture popular attention, but in the patient accumulation of technical knowledge that made those dramatic events possible. The shipwrights who developed clinker construction, the navigators who learned to read wind and wave, the communities that organized the Lidang system, these represent the quiet heroism of technological development, the kind of gradual progress that creates lasting change without fanfare or glory. Perhaps most importantly, the Longship story offers perspectives on innovation and adaptation that remain relevant in our own time of rapid technological change. The vessels we have been studying succeeded not because they represented sudden breakthroughs, but because they evolved from long traditions of patient experimentation. They dominated their era not through brute force, but through superior adaptation to the specific environmental and social conditions of early medieval Northern Europe, and they eventually became obsolete not because they failed, but because changing conditions made different capabilities more valuable. The lesson here extends beyond maritime technology to encompass the broader patterns of human innovation. The longship emerged from societies that understood the importance of maintaining traditional knowledge while remaining open to incremental improvement. The shipbuilders who created these vessels possessed the patience to refine techniques across generations, the wisdom to preserve what worked while experimenting with what might work better, and the cultural mechanisms necessary to transmit complex technical knowledge from master to apprentice across centuries of development. In our current age of rapid technological change, when entire industries can be transformed in years rather than generations, there remains value in contemplating technologies that developed slowly, achieved excellence gradually, and served their societies faithfully for centuries before gracefully yielding to new innovations better suited to changed conditions. The longship reminds us that the most enduring human achievements often emerge not from dramatic revolutions, but from the patient refinement of deep understanding, the kind of knowledge that can only be gained through generations of careful observation and incremental improvement. As you drift toward your sleep tonight, perhaps you can carry with you the image of those anonymous craftsmen working in countless forgotten shipyards, their hands guided by knowledge passed down through centuries of maritime tradition, their patient labour creating vessels that would carry their descendants to the edges of the known world. In their quiet dedication to excellence, in their willingness to preserve the best of the past while remaining open to the possibilities of the future, they offer us a model of human achievement that transcends the specific technologies they created and speaks to the enduring capacity of patient work to expand the boundaries of human possibility.